Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So this past weekend was really quite something in Russia. I'm not sure what to make of it all, and I'm not sure if anyone knows exactly what to make of it all. But I thought if there was one guy that would have a good sense of what's actually going on, it would be Marcus Kolga, who has been kind enough to talk to me a few times. He's an expert on Eastern Europe with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's a disinformation expert. He's spoken about the war in Ukraine quite a bit, and he's someone who I really respect. A week or two before the war broke out in Ukraine, I had Marcus on the show, and he was the first person I spoke with who said, "We got to take Putin seriously, and this war is going to happen," when a lot of other people were thinking it may not. So, Marcus Kolga, what happened in Russia this past weekend? Please tell us.
Yeah, well, I've been getting that question a lot over the past 48 hours, 72 hours. It's hard to say. I mean, I don't think that we've seen the end of this story, but what it seems like is that this was really the first serious attempt on to dethrone Vladimir Putin in the 23 years that he's been in power. It seems that over the weekend, Vladimir Putin's own reputation has taken I would say almost a mortal hit. I don't think that he will ever recover from the damage that has been done to the facade. And let's not forget that Vladimir Putin's own power, the legitimacy of his presidency, really is dependent on that facade of him projecting this power, creating this image of a strong man and the only man that can really save Russia from the evil powers in NATO, Ukraine, the United States, and Canada. And so that facade is I think, irreparably damaged at this point. There's no doubt that the elites, the oligarchs that are in Moscow, and the ones that scurried out of Moscow very quickly on Saturday, they're smelling that nervous sweat. They're circling. And there's no doubt that there are plots afoot to replace Vladimir Putin. There was a very good article in the Washington Post the other day by Catherine Belton, which suggested, and she had quotes from various different oligarchs who said that they don't trust Vladimir Putin anymore. They don't think that he's actually in control of Russia at this point, and that there was an active search for his replacement. So, like I said,
an active search by who? By the oligarchs?
Yeah, the elites and the oligarchs. So on the inside, they know that Vladimir Putin's days are numbered. If he can't protect them, then they'll have to find somebody else. And so, I think that what we saw over the weekend is a preview of what's going to happen again, I think, within the next few weeks, probably not days, but certainly weeks, months. And I would say now quite confidently that Vladimir Putin's days are numbered.
Really? Well, that's a fascinating point of view. What I've heard is that he trumped, checkmated Prigozhin, and here you had this guy that was the only person that had led any kind of a force that could potentially dethrone Putin. March toward Moscow, got halfway, 2/3 of the way there, and stopped. And left for another country, and who knows whether he was able to take any of his military, his militia, his mercenary army with him. We heard that he had asked for people in the military and the defense establishment to be fired from their jobs. Haven't heard whether that happened. That he wanted to allow his Wagner group to continue separate from the Russian army. Doesn't look like that's happened. So I wondered, did he get anything? And did Putin completely win this thing? And you're saying, no, that's the opposite of what I had perceived.
There are no winners here. And this is the other side of the story, is the Prigozhin side of things. Look, I mean, he has raised the ire of certainly the general staff in Russia's military, the Minister of Defense, and probably Vladimir Putin himself. Over the past 16 months, Putin's own forces have had limited success, and I think that's being generous. They've had limited success in their 3-day operation against Ukraine. The only military unit that's really had any sort of meaningful success has been Prigozhin's Wagner group. in and around Bakhmut. They were dug in there. There were thousands upon thousands of Wagner troops that lost their lives trying to take Bakhmut. And with each step in which, with each gain that they did have, Yevgeny Prigozhin was there. He wasn't there marching on, placing the flag on top of a building. It wasn't the Russian flag that he had in his hand, but it was Wagner's own flag that he had in his hand. And Russia's military leaders were noticing this. I think Vladimir Putin was noticing this. They were becoming irritated, and so they limited the amount of weapons, the amount of ammunition that they were sending to Prigozhin already several months ago. And Prigozhin took to social media and started ranting about this, calling out the Minister of Defense, Shoigu, and the Chief of the Army, Gerasimov. And this was a regular event that he was doing on social media, calling them out. And I think they'd had enough. And last Friday, we don't know who it was, whether it was Shoigu, Gerasimov, or even Putin himself, who ordered Russian jets to fire on Wagner's camps in southern Russia. 30 Wagner soldiers were killed in those airstrikes
The
by
Russian
the Russian
military
Air Force.
attacked Wagner.
That's right.
Seriously.
That's what triggered all of this. It was those strikes on Wagner's camps. And at that point, Prigozhin, already irritated, became even more irritated and said, "I've had enough. I'm marching on Rostov to demand justice." And so during that march, of course, we saw that the Russian army sent helicopters and other aircraft to try and stop that advance. Wagner's forces, Prigozhin's forces, shot down 4 helicopters and a transport aircraft. And then they continued that march. Now, we don't know if this was a decision that Prigozhin took sort of at the spur of the moment, once his troops were killed by those airstrikes on Friday, or whether there was a greater plot, whether there was something happening that we weren't seeing, because all we were seeing were these troops marching into Rostov and Voronezh and on their way to Moscow. But surely there was something happening behind the scenes in Moscow as well. But what it looks like to me is that when Prigozhin got closer and closer to Moscow, he just lost his nerve. So maybe he was made some promises by the elites in Moscow, maybe some oligarchs, maybe they fell through, but he simply lost his nerves. And you're right. Now he's in Belarus. Apparently,
is he? Do we think he is actually in Belarus?
This is the Belarusian government has confirmed that his aircraft landed there earlier this afternoon. Whether that's true or not, it's anyone's guess. But your question or your point about his own troops, he's got 25,000 of them. Half of them are former Russian special forces. Half of them are convicts, rapists, and murderers. Whether they all follow the Pied Piper to Belarus, or whether they are dispersed, or whether they join the Russian army, we don't know. But what we do know is that Prigozhin will probably need a few hundred of them, if not a few thousand of them, to stay alive. Because, as you pointed out, you don't challenge Vladimir Putin's own power and just walk away. Putin allowed him to walk away. He's allowed him to go into exile in Belarus. But I would say, if Vladimir Putin's smart, he may be smart. He's not strategic, but he's no dummy. He will try to take out Prigozhin, because Prigozhin alive with even 10,000 troops, half the forces that he has, it remains a threat to Vladimir Putin and his power, unless there's something else going on that we are not seeing at all, and this is all a big ruse.
What do you think would have happened if he got to Moscow? Yeah, I'm told that there is a completely separate something or other. I'm not sure what it is, but it's a military organization that reports directly to Putin to protect Putin in Moscow. That's completely independent from the Russian military. It's almost like a secret police. It sounds like the SS almost. Tell me, what would have happened if Prigozhin actually got to Moscow?
Well, look, I mean, that's pure speculation, but we know that Russia, most of Russia's troops, all of its military hardware is at the front right now. It didn't appear that he faced any sort of resistance in Rostov, and Rostov is an extremely important center for the Russian army. It's the headquarters of the Southern Military District. This is where much of the war is being controlled from. It's the command and control center of it. And Prigozhin was able to just sort of walk in there. He was even able to walk. After he had declared that he is marching on Rostov and Moscow, he was able to walk into the courtyard of that headquarters. And then he drove right through Voronezh, and there wasn't much resistance that was put up along the way. My guess is that had he continued, he would have made it into Moscow quite easily. I suspect that he may have even made it into Red Square. What would have happened after that? Who knows? But I suspect that if he was really determined to march into the Kremlin, I suspect that he would have been able to do that with the force that he had behind them, because most of Putin's armed forces are at the front. The command structure is in a bit of disarray. They've proven to be completely incompetent. And Prigozhin has proven to be, even though he is as evil as he is, he's a wily fox. And I suspect he would have made it into the Kremlin.
Unbelievable weekend. It was astounding. I was thinking that we were watching the fall of the Berlin Wall all over again. And then it didn't happen. It was like something big is going to happen. And then it didn't happen. Incredible.
I had champagne in the fridge.
You did. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Marcus Kolga in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Marcus Kolga, who is an expert on Eastern Europe, an expert on what's going on with the Russian war in Ukraine. He's a disinformation expert, which is kind of interesting with all the disinformation that seems to be going around the world these days. And he works with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where he writes and speaks and is a pundit and a progast, a wonderful guy, a very intelligent commentator on a lot of things that are going on. Marcus, take a step back, if you could, for a second, and tell us a little bit about Prigozhin. I understand he was a criminal and he was a chef.
Yeah, so he started out his career. I think he was perhaps an orphan, if I'm not mistaken. But in the 1980s, he was a petty thief, a mugger in St. Petersburg. He got caught by the Soviet police back then, and sat in prison for some 8-9 years throughout the early 80s and 90s. When he got out, he started a business selling hot dogs on the streets of St. Petersburg. And, that one stand was quite successful. He bought a couple of others, got involved with the criminal underground, as one does. And once he got involved with the criminal underground, you're going to get involved with the Russian secret police, with the FSB and the KGB. And of course, part of that organization was Vladimir Putin. And so Prigozhin and Putin first became acquainted when Vladimir Putin was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. And that relationship, because I think they have some common instincts, I would imagine, that relationship developed. And because of the nature of that sort of the FSB and the mafia, the corrupt nature of it, Prigozhin was in Putin's favor, and he received some pretty lucrative contracts to provide catering services for the St. Petersburg government, and then eventually the federal
Government. A hot dog vendor and a former petty criminal was given lucrative catering contracts.
That's right. And then many of Russia's schools, and so he didn't just make a bit of money. I mean, he became a billionaire with those through those contracts. And so once that business was going, he somehow found permission to set up Concord, which is the actual formal parent company that owns the Wagner private military contracting company. And so he went around recruiting former Russian special forces, and with the promise of deploying these guys into in some of the hot spots in the global south. Primarily the business was in sub-Saharan Africa, where you had some rather nasty dictators who needed help remaining in power. He offered those services to those dictators in return for access to their natural resources, often diamonds and such, other precious minerals and such stones. And he expanded from there. He got involved in Libya during the conflict there, in Syria, and he's tried to get involved in various different other African countries, Mozambique, South Africa, And of course, now over the past 8 years, he's been involved to a certain degree in Ukraine. And so during that time now, he's been accused of his troops have been accused of having engaged in mass atrocities, rape and murder in Mali, in Syria, and in Ukraine as well. He's a nasty fella, criminal, and certainly, 12 months ago, when Russia needed more troops, he went into Russia's prison system and started recruiting from there. And as I mentioned earlier, half of his force is made up of rapists and murderers. And there was even early report that he had a cannibal in and amongst his troops. So this is the kind of guy that we're dealing with. He's not someone to be trusted. And one other thing I should add is that he, in 2014, started up the Internet Research Agency. This is what's commonly referred to as the Russian troll farm, which is stationed in St. Petersburg and has been charged with interfering in the U.S. presidential elections in 2016, and continues to be active. So this is the kind of guy that we're dealing with. He's quite nasty. He's a brute. He's engaged in all sorts of atrocities, and is someone that doesn't matter what comes out of his mouth, you just don't trust it.
I presume, though, he must have the equivalent of generals. He's got a military establishment. He's not the major tactician, is he? Like, doesn't he have a military system of generals and other people that are helping him out?
Yeah, it's a well-functioning unit. I mean, a lot of them are former special forces guys from the Russian army, and so they're well disciplined. They're very well trained. But again, I mean, he has this ragtag group of ex-convicts who are part of the cannon fodder that he pulls along. And the way that he treats them and keeps them in line. There was a famous incident about 5 months ago, where a Wagner deserter who was offered to come to the front line, and the deal was you come to the front line, you serve for 8 months. Once you're done your 8 months, you're free. You're free to go. You're no longer going back to prison. You're any sort of crimes that you've been accused of or found guilty of, they're going to be pardoned, and you're free to go. But deserters were to be shot. And so he made an example of one deserter where they caught this fella who was fleeing the front lines, dragged him back to camp, tied him down, and took a sledgehammer to his head and videotaped it. So that's how he keeps his troops in line. That's how his generals keep the troops in line. It's a brutal situation.
Do we know anything about who his generals are, and are these people loyal to Russia or to Prigozhin or to nobody, just the money?
They're loyal to the money, but they're also loyal to Prigozhin. So there has been this offer, or rather a demand from Vladimir Putin that the Wagner troops that remain, that they have a couple of options. They have three options. One is that you go with Prigozhin off to Belarus. Now, whether they're allowed to go, that's anyone's guess, because you can't trust Putin either. Second is that you just lay down your arms, go home. Whether Putin allows them to do that is anyone's guess. Option number three is that you sign a contract and join the Russian army. But that's pretty unlikely, because one thing that Yevgeny Prigozhin did do well and has done well is he pays his soldiers a handsome sum, far more than the Russian army pays its generals and officers. He treats them with respect, not those convicts that he's recruited. And through that, I think that a lot of these guys have been working with Prigozhin for some time, and they're quite loyal to him. So I suspect that Putin will not be able to lure any of these soldiers into his army, or very few of them at least.
And he's done a very good job of criticizing Putin's army and the generals that are running the Russian military. So why, if you were part of the successful Wagner group, would you want to join and work for and take orders from the Russian military establishment?
Yeah, you got it. I mean, what they also see is if they're going to go to the front lines again, they don't want to do it with these Russian generals, because they do believe that they are completely incompetent, and there's no, these generals have given them every reason to believe that. And so I don't think any of them has interest in serving any Russian generals.
And if they've all become rich being mercenaries for Wagner, why would they go home? and lay down their arms. Aren't they just going to go to Belarus and start all over again?
Well, and that's the next question is really what happens if even half of these guys do go to Belarus? What are they going to do there? I've talked to friends in the Belarusian opposition who are really concerned that these guys represent, pretty much an occupying force once they're in Belarus. Try to get them out once they're in there. It's going to be very difficult. The other concern is, what if there's an uprising, an organized uprising against Lukashenko? There are these, Russian special forces essentially that are in the country, these bloodthirsty mercenaries who will mercilessly put down any sort of pro-democracy uprisings in the future. And then there's this sort of remote concern that if he does get, say, all 25,000 of his troops into Belarus, there's that option, that possibility that that Prigozhin could open up a new front in the north on Belarus's border with Ukraine. This is something that no one's talking about at this point, but it's something that I'm keeping an eye on because it gives Putin this option to say, look, this isn't Belarus that's attacking Ukraine. It's an independent mercenary force. They're not even Russian forces for that matter. If Prigozhin, independently decided to attack Ukraine from the north, it's a possibility. It's remote, but it's possible. And I think that that sort of action would throw a real monkey wrench into Ukraine's counteroffensive plans that they already have in place. It's not something that they would have calculated with when they were making those plans.
NATO would not attack Russia directly, but would NATO come in and attack a mercenary force attacking from Belarus?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't know. It's entirely possible. But again, I think that possibility is rather remote. But you don't want to have this private military group lurking around right in the heart of Europe. Let's not forget that Minsk is only 20, 30 kilometers from the Lithuanian border. And so having these guys lurking around there, I think it's going to make everyone feel a little bit uncomfortable, including Belarusians.
Unbelievable. What's the Russian defense going to be like without Wagner Group as part of it?
That's a good question. On Saturday we saw some pretty large defections. Those videos continue to emerge today of Russian troops pretty much en masse surrendering at various different parts of the front. There are reports now that Ukraine has taken back territory that it hasn't held since 2014. So it's making some pretty significant gains. Troop morale from the reports that I'm reading is amongst Russians. It's been low for the past 12 months, but after this weekend, it's even lower, and nobody really wants to continue engaging in this fight, especially those troops that were in and around Rostov over the weekend. They know what happened there, and that news is trickling out through the front. One area that I would be very concerned with, and I think a lot of Ukrainians are concerned with right now, is the situation in Zaporizhia at the nuclear power plant. There have been reports over the past week or so that the Russian forces have kicked out all the Ukrainian workers. There are reports of explosives being loaded into some of the structures at the power plant. And so I think everyone is a little bit nervous about what the Russian soldiers there might be up to, why they're filling up Europe's largest nuclear power plant with explosives. We saw what happened with the Kolga dam just a few weeks ago. That was imploded by all accounts from the inside. So the Russian forces may be preparing for some sort of a massive nuclear meltdown, which quite frankly would slow down Ukraine's counteroffensive. I think it would put a pause on all of that, because Ukraine, I would bet that if there was a catastrophe at that power plant, the Russian forces would take off pretty quickly back for Russia, and they would leave it for the Ukrainians to clean up. And so that's where Ukraine's focus would be, is cleaning up the disaster site while giving Russia a chance to reconstitute its forces and give them a rest for a bit, and by the time that gets cleaned up, who knows how long it could take. And so,
But the area, tell us where this is, because the area of contamination would be quite wide and would hit not only Ukraine but Crimea and some of Russia, would it not?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on which way the winds are blowing, but this is a nuclear power plant that sits pretty much in the southern most section of Ukraine, the southeast corner of Ukraine, as it were. So that contamination would almost certainly fall into the Black Sea. It would probably float over Turkey, much of Central Asia. If the winds were, I think the prevailing winds are going eastwards, so I think Russia would also be affected by it. But you never know. I mean, when the Chernobyl meltdown happened, that radioactive cloud floated north over the Baltic Sea, and was over Scandinavia as well. So, and this nuclear plant is, if I'm not mistaken, about twice the size of Chernobyl. And so the fallout would be massive. The consequences would be huge. And the area that's left uninhabitable by a meltdown there would be quite massive.
And it's located in one of the areas that's an industrial heartland for the Ukraine, is it not?
Yeah, sure. It's not far from Mariupol. I mean, the entire coast. It's not far from the Black Sea coastline. So, I mean, it would be disastrous if that were to happen. But again, we can't rule it out given all the activity we've seen around it, and Russia's proclivity towards creating these sorts of man-made massive catastrophes.
Marcus, one of the things that I kept on wondering is if Prigozhin has proven that Russian defenses in this town that was the military establishment that he took over, and on the freeway on the way to Moscow, are so poor, so non-existent, because as you said, they're all at the front. And we know that the West has put some limits probably on Ukraine and doing things in Russia itself, attacking in Russia itself, but there have been some. Why doesn't that suggest that Ukraine should do a lot more work, frankly, behind the lines?
And maybe they will. Clearly, the Russian people are apathetic. They didn't rush out to the streets to support Putin. In fact, the people of Rostov were high-fiving a lot of these Wagner troops. Now, there were some people who were yelling at them and berating them when they entered town, but again, they entered town unopposed, and that's because Vladimir Putin has created this culture of apathy in Russia. Nobody cares. If there's a new ruler that comes around, that's fine. They're not particularly concerned. And so, yeah, I mean, I would agree that Ukraine should be taking advantage of this situation and figuring out a way to do it. There are a couple of groups, the Free Russia Legion, that's run by a former Russian MP and opposition activist, Ilya Ponomarev. They've taken responsibility for a lot of the what's being termed by the Russian government as banditry, the resistance movement that's been attacking various different towns. Belgorod, of course, was famously attacked by them. I would bet that this organization, the Free Russia Legion, will become a lot more active in the coming weeks and days. And I also know that there are some people who are active with these resistance groups who are communicating with the oligarchs and with the elites in Moscow. Those lines of communication are open. I mean, they don't go through Moscow. They're quite they circumvent Russia in many ways, but those lines of communication are open. And so it wouldn't surprise me if those the discussions between the elites and some of those active resistance movements, if they weren't heating up right now and intensifying. And so, like I said, what we saw over this weekend is I think it's just a preview of what's to come. And I think the next time, because Vladimir Putin has demonstrated that he is so weak that there would be so little resistance if there was some sort of an armed coup or rebellion in Moscow. There's a lot of organizing going on right now, and the next time this happens, it's not going to fall apart so easily.
We're chatting today with Marcus Kolga about what's going on this past weekend in Russia with the Prigozhin Wagner group potentially marching into Moscow. At least it looked for half or three quarters of Saturday that was going to happen. I was mesmerized by the television, watching the reports of what was going on, and like you, I had the champagne, but I didn't get to open it because what I was thinking was going to happen got stopped just as I was expecting. This comparable to the fall of the Berlin Wall kind of an event, and it didn't happen. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Marcus Kolga in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real pleasure of mine to chat with Marcus Kolga again, a guy that I've chatted with a few times over the course of the last, 18 months, I guess, in regards to this Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war, and this unbelievable experience this weekend where it would look like someone might actually be taking over from Putin and challenge. One of the things, Marcus, that numerous of the pundits on the television, etc., were talking about and worried about is that who knows who might take over, and that the people that it might take over if Russia became a failed state, was the word that some people used, might be far worse than Putin. What do you think? What would happen if Putin got deposed? What would actually happen in Russia today?
Yeah, I think that a lot of Canadians, a lot of people in the Western world that I've been speaking to, and they have that same question. And, I think that everyone sort of just presumes that there's going to be something better once Vladimir Putin goes away. That there's some sort of there's a liberal or a Democrat waiting in the wings to jump in there, and it's the forces of good and democracy that'll win the day. And I wish it were like that. But unfortunately, all of those good Democrats, those liberals, who really could eventually take over and transform Russia into a democratic state that respects the rule of law, human rights, and its neighbors, all of those people are gone. They've either been killed, like Boris Nemtsov in 2015. They're in exile, like Garry Kasparov and Mikhail Khodorkovsky, or they're sitting in prison, like my friend Vladimir Kara-Murza or Alexei Navalny. And so Vladimir Putin's repression has ensured that the democratic opposition movement in Russia is going to have a very hard time in taking advantage of any sort of destabilization in Russia, the kind of thing that we saw over the weekend. And so I think that what Canadians should be expecting is a time of prolonged turbulence once that transition does happen. Who takes over? It could be much worse than what we have today. It could be someone like Yevgeny Prigozhin. It could be the chairman of the Russian Security Committee, Patrushev, a former KGB and FSB man, who's a rabid nationalist, a neo-fascist, as it were. Someone like him might take over. Someone like the Prime Minister, Mistushin, he might take over. He's a bit more of a centrist. I think that would actually be a good thing for everyone if he took over in the interim. But I think that whoever takes over now, again, it will not be a Democrat, it will not be a liberal. That change, that person who comes in next will be around for a while. It might last 6 months, it might last a year, may last a couple of years. But there will come a point where the Russian people will say enough is enough. Whoever comes in next will not have the opportunity to become as entrenched as Vladimir Putin has. And like I said, eventually the Russian people will rise up. Vladimir Putin, over the past 23 years that he's been in power, has not produced any significant improvements for the people of Russia, perhaps in cities like St. Petersburg and in Moscow. But outside of those cities, in the regions, there's been very little change. 1 in 3 Russian hospitals, for example, doesn't have running water. Most people would be shocked to hear that. And some people
One in 3 Russian hospitals don't have running water?
1 in 3.
Seriously?
Yeah.
How can you have a hospital without running water? How can you wash your hands?
I don't know. But that's the case, unfortunately. And this is the case, it's primarily in the regions. You're not going to find a hospital like that in St. Petersburg or Moscow. And this isn't Western propaganda. It's not CIA-generated propaganda or NATO created propaganda. This is directly from the Russian Auditor General's report from 2019. That fact is taken straight from the Auditor General's report. And so, I mean, that's just one example, but life for Russians in the regions is quite poor. Living standards are quite low, and life expectancy is miserably low. And so, I think the Russian people, especially in the cities, they're starting to realize this. They have started to realize this when Alexei Navalny returned to Moscow in 2020. Tens of thousands came out in the streets, children as young as 8, 9, 10 came out to the streets demanding better. Of course, those protests were violently repressed. And since the war began, new laws have been passed outlawing any sort of criticism of the war. And I think the irony with Prigozhin is that, he's probably the loudest critic and tried to march upon Moscow. He seems to be getting away scot-free, but someone like Vladimir Kara-Murza, whose crime was to go on to CNN in April of last year and criticize the war, he's facing 25 years in prison in a dank modern Russian gulag. But Prigozhin is able to get scot-free. Got off scot-free. And so anyway, I do hope that the Russian people, and I do believe that the Russian people will eventually rise up. I hope that if we do get someone like Mistushin in there the next time, maybe some of these political prisoners will be released. Maybe there will be some sort of an opening. And if there's some sort of an opening, that might give the Russian democratic opposition a chance to start regrouping and forming challenging those in power right now.
Marcus, you're a disinformation expert. I've spoken to numerous different people in Ukraine who have family members in Russia, and they're not speaking to them anymore. And the reason why is because their Russian family members or friends have, it would appear, to them at least, and they believe this, is that they've believed and bought into Putin's propaganda machine. And so the question is, like, if they actually believe Putin, if they believe the justification for the war, if they're not listening to Prigozhin and other critics, will they ever rise up?
Yeah, I think there's a part of the Russian population that will rise up. I was at I had the privilege of joining a conference of the Russian opposition in Vilnius, Lithuania, about 4 weeks ago. There's a 2-day conference where all the opposition leaders came and basically sat around a table and discussed what they're doing and how they might advance their cause in Russia. And one of the questions, it was very similar to yours: what's going on? Where are the opinion polls in Russia? And opinion polls in Russia, quite frankly, just you can't trust them. Because of the repressive laws. So, if someone comes to you and asks you, do you support Vladimir Putin's war? I mean, you've basically got a gun to your head when that question is being asked. So, of course, you're going to support it, or you're going to say that you support it. But from what I heard from these opposition leaders, and some of them are active in polling and collecting information through different, very creative ways, what they're suggesting is that about 80% of Russians under the age of 45 are against this war, but they don't want to come out and say it. They're afraid the repression is working on them, but they've had enough. They want out. It's really the older generations, this 60, 65, 70 plus. These are people that are nostalgic for Soviet power, for that superpower status. They see Vladimir Putin as he wants them to be seen, as the successor to Stalin, and so they do support the war. So I think that what the Russian opposition, and I think the Canadian government and our allies need to do is start figuring out a way how we can start connecting with those Russians who are perhaps apolitical, but those that are thinking of a future without Vladimir Putin, that 80% of the 45-year-olds in Russia. connecting with them and working with the Russian opposition, with Russian civil society organizations, with Russian independent media, supporting them so that they have the tools that they need, the resources so that when that opportunity presents itself for a potential democratic transition, that they have the tools they need to take advantage of that opportunity. And so I think right now is the time when we have that chance to help work with them, to connect with them, to guide them, so that when that moment comes, when Russia does become free, when it does become democratic, that those new leaders know exactly who their friends are, and that we can start building a far more peaceful European and transatlantic alliance that then finally starts to challenge what China is doing.
The U.S., President Biden particularly, seemed to go out of their way to say they had nothing to do with what was going on this past weekend with Prigozhin. Because I guess they didn't want to be blamed by Putin and the Russian establishment, obviously, for anything. Given that, can we actually support the Democratic, the potential opposition, the people that you've identified as being against Putin? Like, can we actually do anything?
Yeah, there's a lot we can do. And yeah, we want to make sure we distance ourselves as much as possible from Prigozhin. That's probably a wise move. But I'll tell you, in my work on disinformation, what I'm seeing is that those conspiracy theories are already swirling about, that this was a CIA operation, a NATO-backed operation, that Prigozhin is actually a NATO agent. So those conspiracies are already swirling
Oh my God,
about.
you're kidding.
No, it didn't take more than 24 hours.
People
So
will
they're
believe almost anything.
primarily on the far left, with who we call the tankies, and the far right. But back to your question. So how do we support these groups? There are many ways. I think we look to the Baltic states. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are doing a great job. Lithuania, in particular, is doing an outstanding job of housing these exiled Russian opposition leaders, independent media. Poland is doing a great job of it. And there are a lot of them in Germany, although I'm not sure how much support the German government is giving them. But what Canada should be doing is talking to the Baltic states, finding out how we can help them help the Russian opposition and civil society groups. And certainly, I think through funding, we have funds available to promote international development and such throughout the world. One of the things that we've sort of retreated from since the end of the Cold War is the promotion of democracy. I think that for some reason we thought that was democracy and democracy promotion was a dirty word. I think that some of the U.S. experiences in the 1970s and 80s may have turned us off that. But I think we need to face it that democracy is flawed, but it's probably the best and most equitable system of government in the world, and it's something that we should, and the values that it enshrines and defends. I mean, these are things that I think that we want to promote. I think that we all can agree that a Russia that is democratic and recognizes and upholds the rule of law is something that is a Russia that we can work with.
Well, that's something we've been hoping for since 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall.
You're right. And
the breakup of the Soviet Union.
That's right. And so supporting those people, whether it's with some funding, with resources, I think that the funding their activities to a certain degree, funding education, awareness building amongst them and within Russian independent media, and helping them figure out ways, like I said, to beam their messages of truth and the facts back into Russia. I think that's one way that we can start working with them.
On Saturday and Sunday, the word that I had heard from the American establishment and Biden was that he had talked to his allies in France and the UK and Germany. No mention of Canada. And then, surprise, surprise, on Monday, Canada was included in the allies that he had talked to. Does Canada have a role here at all, or are we forgotten?
Well, this is a topic for another hour-long conversation. Look, I think that I really get annoyed when people start talking about Canada being a middle power and sort of saying, oh, what can we do? What can we do on the world stage? Canada's a G7 nation. That's a pretty exclusive club. Our economy is amongst the largest in the world. We have much smaller NATO members that are doing a lot more and are having a much greater impact. We just need to recognize the fact that we are a strong middle power. We are a powerful nation that has a wonderful tradition of keeping the peace and intervening in situations where smaller nations are being bullied. We have a strong economy. We should use that power. We should use our knowledge, our resources to get involved and start promoting democracy. I think if we start doing things instead of just constantly hoping that we can just get a seat around a table where we just sit like quiet church mice, let's do something. We have the power. Let's use it, and let's use it for good. We can do it. And let's not be afraid of criticism. People will criticize us if we try to do the right thing, but we should start doing the right thing before we start worrying about criticism.
We can do it. Do it the right thing, Canada. Sounds like a slogan. Sounds good.
Yeah.
We're going to take a break, final one, and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes with Marcus Kolga talking about what happened this past weekend in Russia. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Marcus Kolga. He's with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's a disinformation expert. He's an Eastern European expert. He's someone that's been someone that I've really trusted to have an interesting and current and thoughtful point of view on what's going on in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine in the past 18 months. And so thank you, Marcus, for that. I really appreciate it. Let's turn to that. Do you think those Russian soldiers at the front heard about what went on Friday night, Saturday, etc.? Do you think they're influenced by it? Do you think they can possibly have any morale left? Like, how can a Russian soldier that has heard about the Wagner Group and how successful they've been and how supportive they've been of the Russian military efforts turn around and march on Moscow and completely destroy the critique, the rationale that Putin had for the war, with his comments that there was no Russians that were under attack in Ukraine. There was no Nazification that had to get put down. How can they listen to that and still go out and want to work for the guy, want to fight for the guy, want to die for the guy?
Well, look, that's a great question. Especially after Prigozhin's criticisms, I'm sure that there are ways for that information to get through to some of these troops. The fact that Prigozhin said out loud this weekend that this war is not about NATO. There's no threat from NATO. It's not about Ukraine. There was never any threat from Ukraine. This is all about Vladimir Putin holding on to his power. And that's the only truth that I think Yevgeny Prigozhin has spoken. But realistically, whether these Russian troops got that message, whether they heard about the news of what happened in Rostov and Voronezh, it's hard to say. Russian soldiers nowadays have their cell phones confiscated. They're not allowed to take them on the front lines because they were taking a lot of photos in the early days of the war, sending them back to relatives, and all of those images, all those messages were being intercepted by the Ukrainian government, which is one reason they were as successful as they were. So at least, the Russian army learned from that. But given the enormity of that story, I think it would be very hard for the Russian army to keep their soldiers in the dark much longer if they don't know about this. This information has a way of trickling out. Yevgeny Prigozhin, I'm sure, has allies, as you mentioned, within the army. I'm sure that those commanders, those soldiers who might be sympathetic, might have some connections to Wagner. They're hearing about it. And once that word gets out, it's going to spread like wildfire. And so I do suspect that the already very low morale amongst those Russian troops is only going to get worse. And as I mentioned earlier, we have seen mass defections already. There are videos of Russian troops just giving up in their trenches, and not giving up to Russian or Ukrainian soldiers approaching those trenches, just drones that are flying overhead. These Russian soldiers are looking up and signaling that they just want to give up. They understand quite well now, and I think they've been starting to get it slowly over the past 15 months, that this war has nothing to do with what Vladimir Putin claims it's about, protecting the motherland, because there is no threat to the motherland. I think they're starting to realize that this is a neo-imperial colonial war to subjugate another country. And they don't understand, these soldiers, and I think most Russians who understand the facts and the truth of the situation, they don't understand why they're engaged in this war. It makes no sense. It has drawn Russia back economically. It's on the brink of collapse. As I mentioned earlier, the things that Russians most desperately need, like running water in their hospitals, that's not going to happen anytime soon, because Russia has lost a considerable amount of its revenue. It's being poured into this insanely unstrategic operation. And I think Russians are starting to realize that, and as are those troops on the ground. So I don't want to jinx anything, but I suspect that the Russian war effort is going to slowly peter out over the summer, unless there's something dramatic, very dramatic, that happens that inspires these soldiers to keep fighting for Vladimir Putin. But like I said, I think we'll see more successes on the Ukrainian side. Because I just don't see the will of those Russian soldiers to keep fighting. It's disappearing.
You had your champagne that you didn't get to open. I was glued to the television expecting to see the equivalent of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It didn't happen. That said, you're a historian. A year from now, 5 years from now, do you think we'll look back at this weekend and still see it as a turning point?
Yeah. It was a big deal. It was a flashpoint in this entire conflict, and I think it's one of the most aside from the Russian invasion in 2014, the one that happened 16 months ago, it stands up right next to those. And it may even be important, because I do honestly believe that this is the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin, and this is not. I don't think that there's any way that Vladimir Putin, I don't think that his regime recovers from this. There's no way. It's not possible.
You heard it here from Marcus Kolga, the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin. I hope you're right. Well, that's our show for tonight, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And Marcus, again, I really appreciate you joining us and sharing with us your knowledge and your opinions and your intellect and your historical references, because I really quite enjoyed those. That's our show for tonight, everybody. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Marcus.